Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We gave people a few minutes to tune in, and we're going to go ahead and get started now. Welcome to today's event, Leading the Social Sector in a Time of Crisis, hosted by the Rustandy Center for Social Sector Innovation. I'm Carolyn Grossman, and I'm the Senior Director of Programs and Global Initiatives at the Rustandy Center and Adjunct Assistant Professor of Strategy at Chicago Booth. For those of you who are interacting with the Rustandy Center for the first time, we are the Social Impact Hub at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business for people committed to tackling complex social and environmental problems. We're an important part of the university's social impact ecosystem, and we promote innovation, advance research, and develop the people and practices that can accelerate social change. We know that some of you on this Zoom webinar had planned to attend our annual Onboard Conference on Nonprofit Board Service in Chicago on April 3rd. Of course, we had to cancel the vibrant in-person conference due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Ever since making the decision to cancel Onboard 1 month ago, the world has dramatically shifted. You're invariably grappling with many challenges personally, changing organizational priorities, uncertain futures, health concerns, and more. And we certainly hope that you and yours are healthy and safe. And our hearts go out to those who are on the front lines tackling this and to those who are not in good health. If you're here today, you're also asking, how can I make an impact on my community during this time? This is a question the Rustandy Center has been thinking critically and intensively about. We are developing a COVID-19 pro bono consulting program to match Booth MBA students with nonprofits in need of strategic support. We're conducting joint research with the University of Chicago Poverty Lab to better understand the impact of COVID-19 and the COVID-19 crisis on small businesses and on households. And we're adjusting our events, not only in format, but in content, to provide responsive resources to today's situation. And today's event is an example of that effort. While everyone's reality has been altered due to COVID-19, this crisis is presenting particular challenges for social impact organizations. Whether you work for a social sector organization, sit on the board of a nonprofit, or are passionate about social impact work, you've experienced firsthand the challenges the sector is facing right now. And you might be dramatically shifting your priorities, providing services for an expanded range of needs, or facing extreme losses. Ultimately, those most impacted by this crisis are the people your organizations, the ones you're connected with or passionate about, exist to serve. So this begs the question, how can the social sector respond to COVID-19? This question is at the heart of today's discussion. And today we'll grapple with this question by helping you understand how recipients of services are coping with increased scarcity, a plan for potential short and long-term changes to the social sector, and how folks are beginning to think about planning. We'll be talking about honing leadership skills to respond to today's crisis and prepare for future challenges, and identifying ways to support organizations and people most in need. Before I introduce our panelists and we kick things off, here are some logistics for today. Our panelists will begin by discussing a series of questions, which include topics submitted by some of you ahead of time. Thank you for that. It really helped us understand where the minds are. If time allows, which I'm confident it will, we'll take some questions from all of you. If you have a question, please submit it via the Q&A chat function within Zoom. Again, we'll try to get to as many questions as time allows. I'd like to thank our onboard sponsors, the Bank of America, Desmond and Ahern, and David and Judy Maley, for making this event possible. It's our hope that it will provide tangible, action-oriented resources to help you support the organizations and people most impacted by this crisis. Now, let me introduce you to Julia and Angelique. Julia is currently the Philanthropy Executive in Residence at the Rustandy Center for Social Sector Innovation, Chair of the Board of MacArthur Foundation affiliate Lever for Change, Distinguished Non-Resident Senior Fellow in the Brookings Institute's institutions, metropolitan planning policy, Metropolitan Policy Program, and Senior Advisor to the Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities Philanthropic Collaborative. Welcome, Julia Stasch. Julia Stasch is also immediate past president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Angelique Power is president and board member of the Field Foundation. She chairs the board of Enrich Chicago, an organization she co-founded dedicated to racial equity in the arts, and also serves on the board of Forefront Illinois and the advisory committee of the Illinois Justice Project. Angelique Power is also a 2015 Fellow of Leadership Greater Chicago. With that, please join me in welcoming Julia Stasch and Angelique Power.
So, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us in what we hope is going to be a useful and timely conversation. Angelique and I usually get together over breakfast. We huddle over what we usually order, and we talk about an incredible range of topics. So we're really pleased to invite you to sit with us and talk about something that is really important today. Now, lower your expectations. This is not a formal presentation. This is not PBS. This isn't my home studio, nor is this an expert how-to session. You know what it is? It's just food for thought for people who are leading or who are interested in the nonprofit sector. Some things to think about as the world around us is changing in really new and confounding ways. Now, we've organized our conversation around these questions, but as Carolyn mentioned, some of you submitted really terrific questions, so we will try to weave in answers to some of them. Now, some of your questions touched on topics that we're not going to be able to address, like fundraising and coaching and jobs. These are all critical issues right now, but beyond the scope of this session. So let's dive right in. What's going on? I thought Angelique and I talked a little bit about this, and she's going to take it from a macro perspective.
Well, thank you, Julia. I am always honored to be in conversation with you. And thank you to the Rustandy Center for hosting us again to have one of our chats. You know, I was thinking about this moment the other day, and what struck me is that everyone in the entire world is fighting the same enemy right now. And it underscores the symbiotic nature of our existence. What happens in one part of the world affects another part of the world. What happens on the south side of Chicago affects the north side of Chicago. Our health is connected to each other. And so if you're not okay, then I'm not okay. And I think that these concepts, if you're not thriving, then I'm not surviving. These concepts underpin the conversation we've been having for years around what does equity mean and what does it look like in practice. And when we say we're interconnected, are we? When we say segregation actually impacts all of us, does it? But I think it's made plain through the coronavirus that we are all absolutely part of the same fabric. And I think later we're going to start to imagine what happens post-COVID-19. But this concept of interconnectivity is critical as we imagine the future.
So I think what I would do is bring this a little bit sharper into focus and take a look at what's really happening to nonprofit organizations themselves. They're just a subset of the whole society and of the economy. Now, we all know, and I'm sure each of you has seen heroic efforts to connect and to serve and to advocate. But what this time has also done is it really has put in sharp relief the fragility of the sector as a whole. It's clear that there has been an incredible lack of investment in nonprofit organizations, operations, and in their people. Now, organizations, of course, often fail to invest because they lack the funding, they lack the time, they lack the resources, and sometimes they even lack the expertise. And it is a fact that foundations often are not willing to provide the resources and the funding for these infrastructure investments. I've seen research and reports that actually an astounding number of organizations are truly cash strapped. They don't have enough money to last 60 or 90 days, if that. Now, it's not a myth that the sector is dependent on overworking people, underpaying them, and relying on people to work long hours without pay, sort of a sweat equity. And apparently that's okay, because a lot of people think that being passionate about your work is actually payment enough. Now, I came across recently a quote I think that is really applicable to the moment. It was from Warren Buffett. And he said, "You actually don't know who is swimming naked until the tide goes out." And so I think the tide is out here on the nonprofit sector. I think that in the context of understanding the nonprofit sector, it's really important as we take a look at the second question, which is, what are the effects of increasing scarcity? Now, scarcity, that's a reality that's existed a long time. It's exacerbated now, and there's no question that it will continue to exist into the future. But it is a word that is emblematic of many, 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 many people's experience of the coronavirus. Every one of us, Angelique and me, and I think every one of you, need to understand what scarcity does to people and to consider the implications for nonprofit organizations' policies and their programs. Now, credit to this thinking, not mine, but that of a wonderful Booth professor, Sendel Mullinatten, who studied this issue in depth. He has a book that I recommend. It's called Scarcity, Why Having So Little Means So Much. What he found was that scarcity captures people's minds. And when it does, they make irrational, counterproductive decisions. Now, all of us have had the experience. I have, I know you have. You've had the experience. If your mind is focused on one thing, not much else can get in there. So if you're worried about food for your children, if you're worried about where your next rent payment's going to come from, if you've lost your job or you're worried about it, all your other abilities suffer. Self-control, your attention, your ability to do long-range planning. What it does, it turns on its head the notion that people are poor because they make bad decisions. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, it is living in the state of constant scarcity that actually leads people to make bad decisions. Now, many, many people, I'm sure many of us on this call, sometimes think about qualities that are often associated with character, like impulsive behavior or lack of persistence or poor performance in school or work, poor financial decisions. These instead might be products of the pervasive feelings of scarcity. So if you're a board member or a leader, I recommend that you ask yourself the question, are you undermining your impact by not building enough what's called fault tolerance into your programs to help people succeed? I actually recommend the book. It'll make you a better leader. Angelique, take the next one. How is philanthropy responding?
Well, can I before
Yes,
I say that,
of course.
We've talked about how we're going to probably argue at some point on this webinar. All right. I'm not arguing, actually. I just want to underscore the point that you've made, because I feel like I've been hearing so much noise lately that is starting to put the blame on COVID victims on the victims. And so specifically, we've been hearing in Chicago, and this is nationwide, that those that are most vulnerable are the ones that are suffering the most from coronavirus. And when I say most vulnerable, I don't just mean in terms of health conditions, I mean the overlaying issues that come with an economic system that doesn't allow certain people to thrive, with redlining that doesn't allow people to live in spaces that have access to healthy foods. Like, all of these policies have overlapped to create a vulnerability, and coronavirus has preyed upon that vulnerability. But in the last week, I think, since we started hearing details about, in particular in Chicago, how 70% of the victims of coronavirus are African Americans, there's been a additional rhetoric which puts the blame on African Americans for having contracted the virus. And it goes something like, well, the underlying conditions of hypertension or obesity, or, you know, all of those things where suddenly you're hand in hand with, you know, victim blaming, as if, you know, there's no room to, one, understand the context that folks live in that create a vulnerability, to understand that COVID-19 comes on top of existing economic, health, education, gender, and information inequities, as well as state violence often that shapes everyday lives. So I think it's really important, in addition to what living in those conditions feels like, to acknowledge, and this is super important for when we get to the rebuild phase, that I think a lot of us are dreaming about, that we keep that in mind, that we've created conditions intentionally that have set certain folks up to be more vulnerable during this health and economic crisis.
Really important food for thought. In terms of how is philanthropy responding, why don't you take a stab at what's happening at the local level, and then I'll talk a little bit about, you know, the whole atmosphere of critique of philanthropy at this moment and how that is playing out as well.
Yeah, so I am normally someone who really critiques philanthropy. You know this about me. And so this is a very odd time for me, because I'm actually kind of reassured by some of the movement that I've been seeing. I think, one, there's an acknowledgement that philanthropy is not going to swoop in and save this moment, that it really has to do with cross-sector work. And so what I'm seeing right now is a lot of funds are being stood up by folks across the philanthropic sector in partnership with the private sector, in deep coordination with the public sector, and individuals in particular are part of this large effort to get resources out, whether financial or otherwise, to people who need it the most. Specifically, there is, you know, there are funds that are popping up across the country, and maybe you'll talk about that a little bit. But in community foundations in partnership with United Ways, there's a collaboration that's being formed. In Chicago, the Chicago Community Trust, in partnership with the United Way, started a fund called the Chicago COVID Response Fund. At this point, it's raised $24 million within 3.5 weeks. There are over 50 foundations that are a part of it. There are lots of companies that are a part of it. And Sean Garrett from the United Way was telling a story on one of the calls about the letters he's been receiving with the online donations, a letter from a 6-year-old saying, you know, I wanted to give this $25 to help my neighbors. So that response fund has sent out over $8 million in the time since it's formed. That's gone to basic needs, 145 organizations. And what's interesting about it is that while there are a lot of organizations like the Red Cross and the Greater Chicago Food Depository, there's a tremendous amount of trusted community embedded organizations that are receiving funds, understanding that they are where folks are going for resources, especially folks like undocumented folks that are off the radar screen of some of the bigger organizations. So that's one of the biggest efforts. There's a statewide COVID response fund, but within different categories, there's a fund for community media to make sure that media organizations, which is where the majority of us are actually trying to get real facts from right now, that journalists are able to do their jobs. Arts organizations, we know that arts have been decimated. And so there's an arts fund that's been started that's doing a lot of work and sending money out for art and for artists. Community organizers, there's a fund that's helping organizers, as well as domestic violence, which is really on the rise right now. There's a fund specifically aimed at that. Healthcare workers, immigration, and more. These are 8 funds that have been started within 3.5 weeks that are sending millions of dollars out.
So let me take this to a different ultra high net worth sort of level. Now, philanthropy has come in for a lot of criticism lately, and you know, in a capsule, it's unelected elites with too much policy power undermining the notion of a democratic society. I think I have that just right.
Ooh, that's
but the fact is that And there's even been mixed reactions to some major gifts from some names that we commonly know, like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, and more recently, Jack Dorsey of Twitter, and many others. Questions are being raised about their motives. I saw one article that raised a question that I liked the way they said it. They said, is it philanthropy or is it lipstick? But I think that the fact is that there is a lot of energy, a lot of resources going into this effort right now. The criticism of the people with many, many, many resources is it a sufficient portion of their overall wealth to really be an example of their leadership during this time? But dropping it down a little bit to foundation level, more than 450 foundations have signed a pledge. What they're pledging is speed and flexibility. They've loosened or eliminated restrictions on their existing grants. They've vowed to make new grants unrestricted and multi-year. They've reduced the demands on grantees for the complexity of their applications, for their annual reports, for the pageantry of a site visit. They've even said that they would join or support grantees in their calls for action. But I think even more importantly, they said, help us figure out what changes we make now we should keep permanently. Now, speed is a good thing, but the fact is that if you act too quickly, you can also be basing your actions on your existing biases. So echoing a little something that Angelique says, what this demands right now is extra attention to explicitly considering things like race and the voices and concerns of affected people and communities. Did you want to pop in on that?
I do. One of the things that, and I'm not saying this to toot our own horn, but some of the breakfast conversations we have in listing the things that you've listed about what foundations are doing right now are things that at Field Foundation we did several years ago. So let's carry that forward. We had a vibrant conversation in our last talk with the Rustandy Center about evaluation and metrics, right?
Right.
So I think some of these things, like not making it so hard to get a grant, not having a ton of bureaucracy, like loosening deadlines, having more trust in a relationship, like let's not wait till Rome is burning to do that. Like that should carry forward. The other thing that I'll mention that I've been thinking a lot about is all of this response, which is so lovely and so needed. I think we have to make sure that we don't get fatigued from it, and that there's funder fatigue, that, well, we all raced to fund COVID, and then we didn't have anything left for those that want to rebuild after it's done. And then here's a criticism that I don't think I've shared publicly, or even really, I've said to my team, but I don't think I've said it out, because we're moving so fast, and this is your last point, but it's a lot of funders at the table making these decisions, as opposed to having folks who are most impacted there. So that is something that we can improve upon. Now, granted, this is 3.5 weeks, millions raised, millions out. I'm not suggesting that it could have been done, in a way, or I could have done it better, but I do think moving forward, we have to have a different set of voices at the table making decisions.
I think that building on that a little bit, it raises one more issue that is under broad discussion right now. And that is the fact that there are calls galore for foundations to dip into their endowments and raise their annual spending over the IRS minimum of 5% annual payout. So the boards of many foundations are debating the urgency and the magnitude of the current crisis versus the unknown but absolutely certain catastrophe of the future. Of course, this conversation is complicated by the fact that this is in a, and I think the word volatile is gentle, volatile investment environment. And so what's on the table is, do we stay the course? Do we retrench in an environment where our investment assets have diminished, or do we expand to meet the moment? And so I think that foundations will dig deep and say, what are our values as they try to answer that question? Now, in terms of what the future looks like, I have a dire prediction. I think Angelique has a hopeful prediction, and I think the world will probably play out somewhere grabbing from both of those notions. Should I do dire first?
Yes, please.
Yeah, it's always better to end on a higher note, but of course the future is going to depend on what kind of scenario actually plays out in the current crisis, whether it's mild, harsh, or severe. Now, every one of these scenarios is going to bring about long-lasting changes. So there's not going to be a return to the world as it was before. And I bet there's a pretty strong agreement that that's okay, because the world as it's been before does not work for many, many people. So the idea of returning to normal should not be our goal. But as Angelique sort of said, the disparities that characterized life for many people before, these are the disparities that have driven the experience of the pandemic. And without careful thought and purpose, aggressive advocacy and action, the fact is that these will define our world into the future. So I think that many of us feel that progress has been made across a number of issues. I think what we're going to see in the dire prediction is that that progress is wiped out. We're going to be facing an even greater proportion: food insecurity, housing cost burden, issues related to employment, low-income communities with commercial areas that are coming back and depend on the vitality of the small local businesses. I've just read today that people are now really worried about a replay of the foreclosure crisis that was started during the Great Recession. Long-term structural changes in the labor market, large-scale public and private layoffs and slow callbacks. Deeply disturbing are the widespread effects of on the next generation workforce, whether it's new college or high school grads, what we call opportunity youth, and especially concerning for returning citizens, and all of the really troubling things that go along with all of those people for whom stability and optimism and hope for the future just are out of reach. I'm talking about disorder in communities, I'm talking about violence. The scarcity mindset will continue long after the crisis wanes. So this is going to, as we said before, affect people's ability to think about and invest in their future. Is that dire enough?
Yeah, I'm gonna get a cocktail instead of
Okay.
water after that. But I think you're right, and I think that that's realistic. I don't think that what I have to say is counter necessarily as much as it's what I'm hoping for in the midst of the realities that you're laying out. I was on a Zoom call yesterday that President Obama was on. And he made a statement that I wrote down and I thought about sharing in this moment, where he said, when someone gets sick, they often, really sick, they often step back and reflect on their lives. And they think, if I had more time, this is what I would do differently. And they reshuffle how they've spent their life and they put their values forward. And so we are in a collective moment of reflection as a society. And my hope is that our reflection and in our reshuffling of priorities, that when we move forward in a way that keeps that idea that we are all interconnected. And I have a few concrete things that I would suggest as foundations for that moving forward. First, what we've been talking about. Racial equity isn't a term, it isn't a fad, it isn't a DEI initiative inside of your organization. It is made plain by the crisis, and it is a roadmap on how to rebuild after. If everyone does not benefit, then everyone suffers. And so how do you, first of all, figure out a way that doesn't put the shareholder at the top and everyone else at the bottom, but actually thinks about how we elevate and move forward with fair value to everyone. And that means being race central, not race agnostic, understanding that we have designed systems that unfairly treat folks of color, as well as poor white folks, as well as differently abled, as well as LGBTQ, but start with race, center that, and center that in all of the rebuild plans. The other thing that I think is really interesting is this bifurcation of the economy that we're talking about, that we've seen and talked about for a long time. The future of work has long predicted this bifurcation, right? And there were these radical ideas that were emerging, like universal basic income, which now we're starting to see from the White House to locally cash transfers that are happening. So what happens if we don't try to return to normal? What happens if we actually try to catch our breath, let people survive, let people thrive, and figure out what a different economic paradigm actually looks like? Our schools, as you mentioned, if in Chicago we don't go back to school, which it's looking very likely that we won't, I have a 10-year-old running around, that means that the students will have lost 25% of their school year. And so what's happened in the wake of that is that we've all become adjunct faculty in our children's education. So how do we actually build on that? How do we manage the digital divide? But also for all of the people out of work, what if there was more of an investment in our students' education, more of an investment in caring for elders, in caring for our neighbors, in community policing, in these ideas that seemed so radical before, that are in many ways a return to the indigenous way of being? Seeing that as future focused is a return to hyper-local gardening, caretaking, educating, taking care of everyone in our community. That's what I would like to predict is ahead of us.
So let me put that just in a tiny different way, and that is, how do we absolutely take advantage of the disruption and to acknowledge the trends and the changes that were underway that have been accelerated? See if we can actually capture some of them and turn them to more positive use. The trend I'm thinking about mostly, you alluded to when you talked about really grappling with the digital divide, is the fact that we're going to come out of this with the demand that our entire society be way more digital, and that we be consistently skilled across every single demographic, every single age cohort. Everyone needs to be comfortable with digital life. And I'm talking here, of course, about nonprofit organizations, many of whom haven't had the time to invest in that infrastructure. They're the ones that are, I think, most naked in this time. But I think that this sort of notion of universal connection facilitated by technology, it was sort of the utopian idea of the internet at the beginning. And we've seen the entire malign effects of the connections and the lowered barrier to access that the internet permits. And so maybe this is the time to recapture the more idealistic aspirations of the universal connection supported by technology. So, but we have to make sure that social sector organizations are better prepared for the next crisis. And so I thought about a few things, and let's go back and forth a little bit. You're a little closer to the ground, so why don't you first touch on a few things that you think organizations that you see day to day should be doing to be better prepared?
Well, I mean, I think that what you've just talked about is understanding that liquidity and working capital is extremely important. I know there are a lot of folks that are listening who are board members right now and who are wondering, what can I do to help? And making sure that any organization is capitalized and prepared for the next crisis, whether that's a financial crisis, which is almost guaranteed. I think that that's extremely important with fundraising.
I was going to add that I think that really critical, and perhaps often led by the board, but in concert with the senior leadership in an organization, is an eyes wide open reflection about why an organization was not prepared, but not just prepared in one way, prepared as an employer, as a provider, but essentially, has the organization been prepared as a business? Have to engage in a critical analysis of the changes in the environment in which they work. Once again, the working environment of the past will not be the working environment of the future. I think two words really characterize a vision for the future that organizations need to strive for, and that's resiliency and sustainability in every aspect, in communications, in connection, in the tools to get work done. To say adaptability is a key leadership attribute, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also it's a characteristic to look for in employees. Think about more partnerships, less competition, and constant, sophisticated access to data. From my own perspective at a foundation, I would really invite organizations to make sure that they have greater candor with their funders. Funders actually don't want to be, they don't want to hear how great things are going. They want to hear how things are actually going, because then there's a greater chance that there can be a partnership between an organization and their funder. But I think most of all, and this actually has nothing to do with mission, this imperative is a much greater investment in the infrastructure of business. I think there's a couple of places to turn, and I was really encouraged to see Booth create the MBA Volunteer Support Network with matching MBA students' expertise in data and strategy and operations. There's also a national platform called Catch a Fire, which connects professionally skilled volunteers with nonprofits and social enterprises in places across the country. As Angelique said, most critical, establish a reserve fund. Like I said, astounding number of nonprofits don't have the resources to fall back on. But another thing in the same vein is make sure that you have the sophistication to know the actual cost of doing business, so that you can demonstrate to your funders what is the true cost of a project grant. I mean, funders are slowly coming to an understanding of the harm that they have actually been causing to nonprofit organizations when they cap the overhead recapture rate. And so one final thing is to take an honest look at the membership on the board. Do you have the access or the expertise, the acumen to legal and finance and marketing operations? Not only the individual board members, but the networks that they can command to help an organization really focus on its resiliency and its sustainability. But I think that leads us to what are the leadership skills that matter the most. I'm just going to remind everybody what we're in is a time of incredible cognitive overload. Information is incomplete. Interests and priorities clash. I'm sure everybody has been in a place where the emotions are really running high. And what, of course, this does, it creates the likelihood of analysis paralysis. So when Angelique and I chatted about this, I think she had, I don't know, was it 6 leadership skills that mattered the most? I have 8, and we will put them together, and they probably are 4 solid things. So give it a try.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot as the president of a foundation that, as we talked about, the market is in turmoil. There are differing opinions about give more now, give more later. I have staff, many of whom are younger staff who are living with renters, who are isolated in their spaces, are not with family. I have staff, and I think each of us are beginning, if we haven't already, to know people who are impacted by the virus. And some of us may have lost people to the virus. So there is a real need to be strategic and to be empathetic, and to constantly adapt day by day. So I made a list of things that are guiding me right now that I think are really important in leadership of an organization. The first is transparency. We're in that process of talking about what a budget for next year will look like. And understanding that given the loss that has taken place in the market, that we have to figure out a place where we can have savings so that we can at least, continue to give grants. And so it's really important, as an example, for me to have the entire staff in a shared screen, see the budget that's being proposed and understand the good, the bad, and the ugly right now. I think accessibility is extremely important. There is such a desire to connect, and I know many of us are zoomed out, but I think as a leader, being accessible to your staff daily, weekly, at any time that they need you, I think it's never been more important. And also allowing for time for the group collectively to huddle. Vulnerability. I think that, it rings false if every day you are the cheery leader through. I think that right now, understanding that everyone is in a crisis collectively, there's bravery in vulnerability, and I think it's important that we understand that we're humans first. Center race, I think that we cannot be race neutral in the approaches that we're designing, in the responses that we're making. I think that a leader who is unafraid to use the data in a way to be directive on strategies is really what's needed in this moment. Do you want me to stop? Or do you want me to keep going? I have two more.
Go.
Okay. I think a willingness to be changed is needed. This moment is changing us, and to refuse to acknowledge it doesn't stop yourself from being changed. It just prevents knowledge of the change that is happening, and it prevents the ability to grow from that change. So whether that is as a mother, as a human, as a president of a foundation, or as a foundation itself, I think we have to be willing to be completely different when we get to the other side of this. And the final thing that I think is really important for leadership is care. Care for self is extremely important. We're in a boundaryless world where work and life all blends together and everything is urgent and pressing. Care for staff is extremely important, and care for community.
So I think that I would just add one or two things. One of the attributes that has always, in my later career, driven me, not so much in my early career to my own sadness, but is a recognition of how important it is to adapt a posture of humility. Too many people are too confident that their solution, their insight, their prediction, their sense of today and their sense of the future is absolutely right. And I've come to the conclusion myself, as I know many of you have as well, is that no one individual's perception or conclusion is as good as it can be until it's forged in a debate or a discussion or some other interaction with other people, whether it's staff or colleagues or even the chance encounter. So this humility, I think, will be a critical characteristic. And along with humility is the willingness to ask for help. I think that what this time is telling us, and the notion that we're all in this together, we're not in it together unless we can open ourselves to taking help from others who have something to offer us that we don't have. And then be sure and encourage those that work for you to be totally comfortable asking for your help, asking for help from each other, because without that, we will not have the whole be the greater than the sum of its parts. I think that I just want to echo one other thing that Angelique said, and that is the importance of a future orientation. The idea of just throwing out the existing playbook, just acknowledging but actually being liberated by the notion that the way we've done things in the past either will not be or doesn't have to be how we do things in the future. And so that notion of openness and vulnerability and honesty and accessibility, all of the characteristics that we talked about, those are things that we've talked about. I'm sure that you've thought of other things and that you will just as beneficially put those to work in situations where you find yourselves. So I think that brings us to the close of our sort of formal, informal conversation. So let me ask the Rustandy Center if there are any questions that arose during the context of our conversation.
Yes, we have a few questions. The first is from an anonymous attendee who says they appreciate the conversation and the perspective of both Angelique and Julia, and they are curious to know about what your thoughts are about the funding and the supporting of local and state governments in moving quickly and responding in creative and innovative ways, which generally goes against their culture. Moreover, the loss of revenues jeopardizes the services they do provide. What's the role of the public and private partnerships in the philanthropy in mitigation and recovery?
Well, I can give like an actual example of how this is being figured out in the moment. And then Julie, especially with your background, I would love to have you talk about that, of sort of best practices. But what I think is really interesting is that right now, organically, I mentioned the Chicago COVID Response Fund, that organically within that 50 plus or foundations, there are task forces that are forming around issue areas. There's also policy areas within the city government that also focus on those same issue areas. And so something that's happened is the Civic Consulting Alliance has created an infrastructure where they are kind of running point between what the policies are that have in many ways created the conditions that we are looking at, as well as what the gap analysis and landscape analysis is that's happening right now through all of these funders sort of focusing on where the needs are in the immediate and also where the opportunity is in the future. And so I think the ideal is that the resources of philanthropy allow for an examination like research, for recommendations to be put into place, and for some resources to help funnel toward the public sector so that they can enact different policies in the future.
I'm skeptical that there will actually be the kind of resources that the crisis demands and the world after could benefit from. I mean, when you think about the situation in Illinois with the structural imbalances created by the longstanding underfunding of pensions, when you realize that the state of Illinois today, without even this crisis, has an unpaid bill roster in the $6 to $8 billion range, think of all the organizations that have performed services, incurred obligations from the government for which their payment is so incredibly delayed and I fear perhaps discounted in some way. So I think that we have to be, our expectations have to be tempered when we look to the government for the kind of support that a new world actually requires. I think that we have to be willing to say that monies that come from other places, be it super ultra rich individuals and foundations and others, may have to be brought to bear, and the social sector may not be able to just be in its historic proof of concept phase or research into what actually works phase, and may actually shoulder over a longer term some of the actual costs of services to individuals. But it also puts a premium on the public sector to actually spend money on things that work. And I think that there is absolutely sufficient in some areas, growing in others, evidence of what actually works, and to legislators and executives to challenge themselves to say, is this dollar going to a program for which there is research that it actually improves the lives of the beneficiaries? So I guess the bottom line is the government is not coming to our rescue. We can challenge it to address its long-term structural issues, but at the same time, we can be champions of public funding for things that actually work.
Great, thank you. And we have many, many great questions, and we wish we could get to them all, but I think we have time for this one last question that I think is relevant to many of the attendees. Kyle Johnson says, thank you both for your candid thoughtfulness in this time of crisis. I am especially appreciative and the focus on the stark disparities, not only in who is affected, but the divide in who will receive relief and who will not, given the power structures and the biases embedded in the institutional response. What power can people on this call exercise to influence a more equitable recovery?
Go ahead.
I'm gonna answer that, and I'm gonna wrap in my answer an answer to Barbara in the chat, who also asked a question. When I talked about everyone being sort of a racial equity advocate, I think it's really important to be able to answer Barbara's question, which is why center race? And you know, when you are faced with what about rural communities, what about differently abled, what about LGBTQIA? And the answer to that is yes. Those are all marginalized communities. But when you look across those different sectors, you see that people of color within rural communities, within differently abled communities, within LGBTQIA communities suffer more. And so you do not dismiss it, but you center race. You start there and then you continue. And so I think everyone on this call who serves on boards, if your organization is taking a race neutral approach in this moment, you become an advocate regardless of what your skin color is. You become an ally and advocate that racial equity and a lens is put in the center of your movement going forward in your rebuild. I also think that just in a practical sense, and I'll turn it to you, Julia, being able to check in on your organizations that you have helped to support is extremely important right now. Checking in on your CEO, seeing how you might be able to help. There's a lot of information out there with the CARES Act, with SBA, being willing to actually parse through it and apply and try to help that organization receive funding. That's something that you can do right away, as well as helping your local school in terms of getting access to technology to help with the digital divide.
So we really hope that this has been useful. We tried to be timely, and it wasn't really the same as when Angelique and I sit there and look at our usual breakfasts, but it wasn't as awkward as I was worried that it would be. So we want to thank you. Thank you for joining us in a conversation. And the one thing that I think both of us want to say is stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julia and Angelique, for such a meaningful discussion. I hope that today's event has equipped you with some tangible takeaways to help you serve your community during this time. Before leaving today, I want to share information on some of the Rustandy Center's COVID-19 crisis efforts. First, the Booth COVID-19 volunteers. A couple of folks asked about this throughout the presentation on the chat. We're facilitating Booth COVID-19 volunteers, a new pro bono consulting program to connect Booth MBA students with nonprofits, government agencies, and social enterprises in need of strategic support due to COVID-19. If you work with a social sector organization in need of support, or you're a Booth student looking to volunteer, you can find links to both applications on the Rustandy Center's website. If your needs are not immediate and take a longer term issue, have a longer time frame, then Booth students are also out looking for summer internships. And if you let us know at the Rustandy Center, we can help connect you to get those internships in front of Booth talent. We're also supporting COVID-19 social impact research. The University of Chicago Poverty Lab and the Rustandy Center are conducting joint research projects to better understand the impact of the crisis on small businesses and on households. You can find the latest information on all of the studies on the Rustandy Center's website. So please do check back for regular updates and findings. In addition, the Rustandy Center is working with the Polsky Center for Innovation at the University of Chicago and is providing resources for small businesses directly. So if you are a small business or know folks at a small business, those resources are on the Polsky Center's website, and any of us at Rustandy can direct you to those. Lastly, we'd love to get your feedback on today's event and your input on what events you'd like to see in the future, be they virtual or when we can be together in person. You can access the survey for feedback at the link on this slide. So please do take a moment to share your thoughts with us. Thank you, and we hope to connect with you all again soon. As Julia said at the end, please do stay safe.